Well, thank you again. It's a real pleasure to be here and share some more ideas and hopefully raise even some more questions with all of you. The topic of my talk this afternoon is why we believe what we believe. And for those of you who are here this morning and for those of you who weren't here, one of the studies that I was talking about was our studies of the Tibetan Buddhist meditators and the Franciscan nuns doing prayer. And part of the reason that we got into this whole discussion about beliefs came out of the result of those particular studies. And I was really intrigued when we had our first nun came in to do the study, and we got her first brain scan, and then we had her do prayer. And after we were all done, I showed her the scans, and I showed her some of the areas that were turned on and turned off. And she was very excited about this, and she said, "Thank you, Dr. Newberg, this is really wonderful, and thank you so much for showing me the changes in my brain during prayer, because this really supports my ideas, my beliefs about how God affects me, how God has an influence on who I am as a person. And thank you so much for doing this and for making sure that, or seeing how I can support my beliefs about God and religion." And I thought to myself, well, it's always a good thing to make a nun happy, I guess. And I said, "You're welcome." And off she went. She was very happy, and I thought that was pretty good. So after we published that results of that study, I got a call from somebody who was from one of the atheist foundations. And I thought, oh boy, this is not going to go over too well. And I said, all right, I'll take the call, and got on the phone. "Hi, how you doing?" And he said, "Dr. Newberg, I just wanted to thank you so much for your research in this area. It's really terrific. You've shown that religion and God is really no more than a manifestation of your brain's function. And thank you so much for doing this kind of research." And I thought, well, I don't want to make an atheist angry either, so that's good. I may as well make them happy too. And I said, "You're welcome," and off they went. So this really started me reflecting on what was going on here. Why were two people who were looking at the same information coming away with a completely different appreciation for what the results were all about? And I realized that it ultimately came down to the belief systems that they each held prior to getting this information. And they manipulated and used that information in ways that were completely commensurate with their existing belief system. And to some extent, they kind of ignored all the other possibilities that may have gone contrary to their belief system. And that is part of what made myself and my colleague Mark Waldman, who's in the back, I think, to start really looking into this question about beliefs. Remarkably, when we actually started to look into beliefs and what the studies had been done about beliefs, we were really surprised that there had been very little that had actually been written about what beliefs were and how they actually affect us and where they come from. I mean, obviously everybody knows about religious beliefs, so that there's certainly been a lot written about specific beliefs, but there wasn't so much written about where these beliefs actually come from. And that was really what propelled us to begin to explore this topic. And it really is kind of fascinating when you think about it, because in some senses, this is a much broader topic than what we were looking at earlier today, because beliefs have an impact on virtually every part of our lives. And in fact, beliefs have a tremendous power over us, and we see this so many times on many different levels. We see this in advertising. We see this in the healthcare setting. People talk about the placebo effect and how even though somebody may be taking something that has no real effect on them, it somehow does have an effect. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Cultural beliefs, how we should behave as a person, how we should behave within the culture of a university, within the culture of a state, a country, a world. We have political beliefs, and of course we just saw a very dramatic demonstration of all of that with the election, and the beliefs of people who are Democrats and the beliefs of people who are Republicans, and how they both look at the same situations and come away with very different views as to how our country should be run, what should be done to solve certain problems in the Middle East and so forth. So these are all beliefs that we have, and of course we have moral beliefs, what we think is right and wrong and what we should do about it when somebody does something right and wrong. And finally, we have religious and spiritual beliefs, which are the more traditionally thought of what a belief is all about. So what I'm going to do today is talk to you about the power of beliefs, where these beliefs come from, and where they interact within the different functions of the human brain. So some of this will tie into what we had before, but for those of you who weren't here this morning, we'll go over enough so that you can see exactly where these beliefs are coming from and how they affect us. Now, from a general perspective, I suppose the first question is, well, why do we believe anything at all? Because I've certainly had plenty of friends and colleagues say, well, I don't believe things, I know things, and which is okay, that's great. But when you actually start to think about it, the question comes as to why we believe anything at all, and I think there's actually a pretty compelling reason why we believe things. In fact, I would argue that everything that we think about is something that we would call a belief. So if we take this slide to be kind of the universe, right? This would be kind of reality, everything that's out there. Somewhere within that reality is each one of you. Is your brain floating in that reality somehow, looking out on a world. Now, I mentioned in the morning lecture that we take in millions of pieces of information, but if you think about it, we actually only take in a portion of what is actually out there. So, for example, all of you right now are aware of primarily what's going on right here, right now in this chapel. None of you are aware of what's going on in Los Angeles itself. None of you are aware of what's going back home, back in my home in Philadelphia. So your brain is taking in, even though it's taking in lots of information, it's taking in only a small percentage of what is actually out there in the world. And of that, went the wrong way. Of that, we take even a smaller percentage that brings it up to our level of what we would call our consciousness, the things that we're actually aware of. So when you think about this, what that means is that your brain is filtering a lot of information. It's interpreting a lot of things. It's filling in gaps when it misses something. And it's trying to do the best that it can to create for you a picture, a rendition of what the world is all about. And one of the main points that I want you to all come away with tonight is that the brain makes a lot of mistakes along the way. And I hope that what this is going to show you is that all of the beliefs that you hold, as much as you may think them to be fact, we're going to find out that a lot of the things that we actually do think and believe are a lot more tenuous than we'd like to believe. So that's really one of the main goals that I have for what I'm going to be talking about today. But we're also going to be talking about a variety of different aspects about beliefs and trying to understand where negative beliefs come from, where positive beliefs come from, and perhaps even find ways of making us all better believers in the end. So why do we believe anything at all? Well, I already said that the brain takes in millions of pieces of information and tries to interpret the world. I would argue that the brain is really a believing machine because it has to be. It needs to create beliefs so it can help us to navigate through our world in some kind of clear way that makes sense to us. And therefore, our beliefs are very important to us, as they should be, because it is what you rely on. This is the main thing that you rely on so that you know how to behave and how to act. Because otherwise, you won't know why you got up in the morning to go to class, why you got up in the morning to go to work, why you decided to vote for one candidate versus another. These are the beliefs that we all hold that we need to think about very strongly to figure out where they're coming from and how they affect every part of our lives. So what are beliefs? Well, if you go to the Oxford English Dictionary, there's a couple of interesting definitions there. The first one, which has always been kind of my favorite, is that it's a feeling that something exists or is true, especially one without proof. Now that's kind of an interesting one because it starts out with a feeling. Okay, so it's not saying that it is factual per se, it is some kind of experiential thing, and that it's true in some way, but it doesn't have any proof. Now that's kind of an interesting statement because proof is also, in my view, a kind of belief. What is it that constitutes a proof for one person may be completely different than what constitutes a proof for somebody else. And for example, I'm in the medical setting, so for me, a proof is a randomized double-blind controlled trial. Right? If somebody shows me that, then I say, okay, well that works. Okay, we'll treat people that way. If we have a randomized double-blind controlled trial to treat high blood pressure, and this medicine works, then that's the thing that I'll use in the future to help treat the high blood pressure. But other fields of science have a different kind of perspective on proof. If you're a physicist, you might be looking at some kind of physical interaction between particles. A chemist might have a different perspective on proof. And of course, if you're in philosophy or in mathematics, in sociology, politics, what constitutes a proof can be vastly different depending on your own perspectives about how the world works or how you want to look at something in particular. In fact, the randomized double-blind controlled trial is not going to work very well for trying to solve the economic crisis today. Because by the time we finish doing the study, we'd probably be in another crisis. Right? I mean, if we took that long to figure it out and spent that much money, we'd probably be in more trouble. So we have to come up with other ways of deciding things that don't necessarily constitute what would be a biomedical proof. And therefore, proof is something that becomes very problematic and I think isn't necessarily the best way of trying to define beliefs. Now, Mark and I actually decided to define beliefs this way, and we use this definition in part because it's something that's more easily relatable to the cognitive and psychological processes of the brain. So we said that beliefs are defined biologically and psychologically as any perception, cognition, emotion, or memory that a person consciously or unconsciously assumes to be true. Now, why do we choose this? Well, again, part of it is that we can look at these issues. We can look at the psychology. We can look at the biology of these beliefs. We can look at perceptions. We can look at cognitions, emotions, and we're going to talk about all of these in a little bit more detail in a minute. I think it's also important to note that beliefs can be both conscious and unconscious. Now, there was a very interesting study that was done a couple of years back that showed that if you show a picture of a person of another race to somebody, it lights up their amygdala. Remember, the amygdala is that structure that lights up when anything of motivational importance happens to you. Now, that's kind of interesting because it turned out that even people who did not express any concerns about racism or any problems with that, they still wound up having an activation of their amygdala when they saw somebody, a stranger that they didn't know of a different race. So it assumes that there is some kind of underlying response that our brain has that may be unconscious and affects us in some way, even though the study also then went on to show that if you showed the person a picture of a person from another race that's someone that they knew, and it could be somebody that they knew personally, like a friend, it could be like a celebrity or a politician or something like that, then the amygdala response did not happen. So it is something that you can learn past, but it's also something that becomes an unconscious part of how your brain works. And of course, if you are interested in the field of psychology, so often we find out that people have many unconscious beliefs that affect the way they handle their relationships, the way they handle their jobs, the way they think about themselves, and so forth. And it's often these unconscious beliefs which are more problematic to deal with than the ones that are conscious. Now, of course, we do have conscious beliefs as well, but the important part here is that we also assume them to be true. The brain takes these beliefs and makes us, in many ways, think that this is the way reality is. Now, in some senses, the brain has to do that because it's trying to help us survive in the world. And it needs to have as concrete a way as possible to do that. So it gives you this set of beliefs, and it says, this is the way the world works. And it makes sure that you think that that is the way the world works, and that therein lies some of the problems that we'll be talking about a little later on. But I want to spend a few minutes going through some of these different aspects, these different elements that make up beliefs, because I think it's very important for us to see where a lot of the problems with our beliefs come from. Now, this is just one more schematic to just show you that all these different forces are playing out in the human brain, our perceptions, our cognitive processes, the social influences that are had over us, and the emotions that we have. All of these come to play in terms of the development of our beliefs. Now, let's start with our perceptions. Well, again, the brain exists in a relatively infinite world and tries to take as much information as it can to create for us a clear and coherent rendition of what our world is about and provide that to our consciousness. Now, the problem is that because there's so much information, a lot of it just filters in through our subconscious mind, and a lot of times the brain fills in things just so that it makes sure that we feel that the world keeps moving in a fairly smooth way. The problem is that the brain makes lots of mistakes, and I'll show you some examples of that. But the biggest problem is not so much that it makes mistakes, but it never bothers to tell us that it's made them. Right? So, I mean, it really is amazing when you think about it. And I mean, just as a kind of an interesting example, we had a patient who had a stroke, and they were having problems with language. And we went in and we said, can you tell us what this is called? And he said, it's a machine gun. Okay? And that was kind of a surprise to us. So we took off the tie, and we handed it to him. He said, what do you do with it? And he tied it around his neck. So he didn't start trying to shoot people with it. Now, that's kind of interesting because we said to him, well, why did you say machine gun? And he started to answer by saying, well, I was just kind of playing a joke on you, I was kidding around. So his brain started to fill in information and provide information into the gap, the mistake that he made, to tell him that it was okay. He didn't really make a mistake, he was just kidding around, and we see this all the time. Now, there are also some very interesting examples to show you where perceptions can go wrong, okay? And I would argue that we have ultimately a mountain of misperceptions about our world, and I want to take you through a couple of just cute little examples that help demonstrate that. So the first one is this one. This is a nice little illusion. Some of you may have seen this before. all of you probably see a square in the middle of all this. Okay? There is no square. There's no lines that are drawing that square out. These are a bunch of circles with little wedges cut out of them. But because of the way it's done, it makes you see a square. And not only does it make you see the square, but you almost can envision the shading around the square to see where the lines are and where the interior part of the square is and the outside of the square is. So very easily, your brain can be kind of fooled a little bit to think that you're seeing something that you're really not. Now, this is always one of my favorites. Now, this may look a little different depending on how far away you are. For those of you who are up a little closer, what it looks like is that this thing is kind of bulging towards you. Okay? If you're way in the back, it might actually look more like an X kind of pattern. Okay? And which is also kind of interesting because it gives different perceptions depending on where you are. But the bottom line is that this is basically a checkerboard where every line is either completely parallel or completely perpendicular to themselves. And I went through this with a ruler for at least a good half hour or so to prove that to myself. And what's really amazing is that every time I look at this, no matter how much I know that these lines are parallel and that this is a checkerboard, it doesn't look like it to me. And there's nothing I can do about it. So we already have that problem. Now, if we have problems with things that are not moving, let me show you a couple of cute little things that happen when things are moving. Now, I found this on the internet, and I thought this was really great. This is a little dragon statuette, if you will, and it should be moving in a second. And it's sitting still on the table. But as you move around it, as this camera is showing, it looks like it keeps watching you. Okay? It's really kind of freaky, right? It's really not moving at all. Okay? You can see the background, what it looks like in the background, but it is not moving at all. And in a second, you'll see how they did this. So you're actually looking at the interior of this, okay? It's actually a statue that's going away from you, and they created this illusion by doing this. But in so doing, what happens is it creates this illusion of having this little dragon follow you around with its eyes all the way around, no matter what angle you look at it. So it creates this kind of weird illusion through motion and through the three-dimensional effect that you get that creates a lot of problems on our perceptual processes. And the last one that everybody always likes is this one, in which the mask always looks like it's coming towards you. Even though after a while you realize that you're looking at the interior of the mask going away from you versus the mask actually coming towards you. Okay? Now, I'll leave this up for one more second so you can try to figure this out. But you can imagine the problems your brain is having with perceptions. You can imagine the problems. I'll move on. You're not going to listen to me otherwise. I got your attention somewhere else now. It's amazing you can imagine the problems that you are having, your brain is having perceptually when it can be fooled so easily, and then you step outside of this chapel and the world is whizzing past you at warp speed. There is no way that your brain is going to be able to accurately see and understand and perceive all of the things that are going on around you. Okay? Now, let's just for a minute say, okay, well, given the fact that there are some problems with perceptions, now let's start to think a little bit more about our cognitive processes. Well, this is the part that helps us to develop that proof, that creates the logical, rational part of ourselves that makes us think that we've really got a pretty good grip on what is rational and what is logical, right? So we use these cognitive processes to begin with to help us create our beliefs. Because if you think about it, at one point or another, you had to think about whether your beliefs made some sense. So if you are of a particular religious tradition, if you're a Democrat or Republican, at some point, you had to think about that a little bit. And most likely, it made some sense to you, and you said, okay, fine, this is the way I'll be. Now, that belief may have been presented to you by your family or your friends or something like that, but at some point, it made sense to you. If it didn't make sense to you, then you would struggle with it. If you were brought up in a particular religious tradition and it really did not cognitively make sense to you, it didn't seem logical to you, you would at some point have to somehow reject those beliefs because it would not be commensurate with your way of thinking about the world logically. So you would be forced to try to find some logical alternative that would allow you to look at the world from a new perspective. So it helps you to find those beliefs, but logic also helps you to support your beliefs. So once you have your belief system in mind, then you use your rationale and your logic to say, well, this makes sense, and then you keep developing and supporting the arguments that you already made before. And if you think about it, that's why somebody who does not agree with you sounds irrational and sounds illogical, because it makes sense to you, but if they're not getting it, there must be something wrong with the way they're thinking, right? Because, I mean, ultimately, and we'll talk about this in a minute, it's a lot easier to think that there's something wrong with the other person than there is to think there's something wrong with you. So we have a lot of problems with how we think about things cognitively that create problems for our belief systems in the end. And of course, one other part that I'll throw into this cognitive process is memory. We all like to think that we have a pretty good grasp of memory, and unfortunately, most of the research has shown that our memory really is not so great. For all you students out there, I'm sorry about that, because you're probably studying for your classes now. But the bottom line is that as much as you try to make sure that you remember things accurately, it's very difficult to. And therefore, and also what's also kind of interesting about this is that how you remember something can be very easily manipulated. A cute little study one time showed that if you show people a picture of a car accident, and you ask the people how fast were the cars moving when they hit each other, and how fast were the cars moving when they slammed into each other, you get much higher velocities when you ask it the second way. Just by using a different word, the person remembers it differently and perceives it differently. So our memories, again, as much as we like to think that they're on pretty solid ground, are often not that good. And the further away we get from a particular event, oftentimes the more problematic our memories become. Now, I mentioned some of these functions earlier in my early lecture, but I think it's worth just reflecting on a couple of them. Our brain has multiple cognitive processes that it brings to bear on our world. We look at the world causally. We look at it from an abstract perspective that helps us to figure out how we categorize things and how we think about ideas like politics and morality. We have a binary function that helps us to set up opposites, and our brain loves that. It loves to think about what's good and bad. Very easy for our brain to handle. Unfortunately, we live in a very gray world, so it's not so easy to be able to say, this is right and this is wrong. I have a young daughter who's 8 years old. It's much easier for me to say, that's good and that's bad, than to say, well, that's good, but you know what, it's Thursday and you're a little tired, so it's okay today. I mean, that doesn't work very well on our brain. We have a holistic function that allows us to be able to look at the world as a whole, and we have a reductionist function, which is kind of the opposite, which breaks things down into their component parts. And we also have, I always love our quantitative function. I don't have a chance to talk about it that much, but we see importance in numbers. I bet every one of you has a lucky number. You know, and why is that? I mean, why should any particular number happen to have some kind of power over us or power over the world? But yet our brain is set up in such a way that numbers are very important for us because they help us to understand our world, to make sense out of our world, and therefore we do begin to put a special importance on certain numbers. And we also use them to help us quantify and evaluate things, because numbers don't necessarily reflect an actual quantitative value, but sometimes a qualitative relationship. What is greater than or less than? What is better than or less than? These are different quantitative functions that our brain has that we can then use to evaluate things in our world, oftentimes things that didn't necessarily need to be evaluated in that particular way. And then, of course, we have our emotional functions as well. Now, I mentioned earlier, I showed this slide in the first talk, about the different parts of the brain. So these are some of the areas that are involved in these processes. Our language areas are in here at the junction between the temporal lobe, which is along the side of the brain, and the parietal lobe, which is up here. We have our verbal conceptual parts that do abstract thought. Quantitation is in this general region, a little bit behind that. We have our ability to orient ourselves and to kind of reflect on our spatial processes in the world and how we are to relate to that world. So we have a lot of these different areas of the brain that happen to provide these cognitive functions, these processes for us. But as I mentioned, they are often not functioning as well as we would like. We often try to reflect back and remember things, in which case we don't always get it correctly. And therefore, we have a lot of problems, as rational as we like to think that we are. A lot of the evidence really points to just the opposite, that we often make lots of mistakes in the ways in which we think about things logically. Now, I will just spend a few minutes on a couple of these. So the causal function, this is located the lower part of the parietal lobe. This helps us to think about cause and effect. Now, this is a very important process. It's really the basis of our science. And of course, if you apply it to the human world, then you can talk about social sciences and psychology. And when applied to the spiritual perspective, how we think about the global aspects of where the world comes from and how we relate to the world, this often results in processes related to spirituality and religion, how we think about God as perhaps the fundamental cause of all things. And you could actually do a little thought experiment, if you will. What would happen if you had a brain that didn't have a causal function to it? And that has happened from time to time. People get a stroke in this area that affects their ability to perceive cause and effect. Well, they would not be able to think about the world in a causal way. They would, if they were a religious individual, for example, they would no longer be able to think about God as having a causal relationship with the world. Now, that wouldn't necessarily affect what God actually did, and it wouldn't necessarily affect any aspects about how the world actually works, but it would affect their ability to perceive the world in a way that is commensurate with how the world actually is functioning. So it's very interesting to think about all of these different functions and what could happen when things go wrong with these functions, either on a very specific scale, meaning that somebody's actually had a disease or a tumor or a stroke, or just on the overall level of how all of our brains are actually working and doing the best that they can, making their little mistakes along the way. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the emotions that we have. I talked about the limbic system earlier. This is a slightly different diagram that shows very similar the limbic areas here, which form kind of a C-shaped structure around the central structures of the brain. Here is the amygdala, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. This is very involved in our ability to focus attention on an object of motivational importance. It lights up when something of importance comes into our environment and says, I need to pay attention to this, and then it recruits the activity in the frontal lobe. It says, you got to pay attention to this, so our frontal lobes then can turn on and say, I got to pay attention to this, I have to focus my mind on this, and I have to figure out what's going on. The hippocampus, which is right behind that, is also involved in our emotional processes as well as involved in our memory processes. And I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to focus on this for another few minutes, which is that it makes a lot of sense that our emotions are tied into our memory. Why? Because this is exactly how, whoops, excuse me, didn't mean to hit that. This is exactly how we make sure that we remember the things that are of most importance to us. So my example that I always like to use is that almost all of you probably remember what was happening on September 11th, 2001. It was a very emotional day. And it changed your belief systems. It changed your beliefs about your safety, about your country, about what other people out in the world were thinking about you and our country, and it created a lot of dramatic changes in your ways of believing about things. Now, probably none of you remember what was happening on September 10th of 2001. Now, you all went through it, and unless you had some kind of very emotional day, like you got married or you were starting school or you had a big birthday or something like that, you don't remember it. Because it's not emotionally important, and it's not important for your brain to write that into your belief systems. But something that is motivationally important and is emotional is something that needs to be written into your memory and is something that needs to be able to alter your belief systems, and your brain realizes that and is designed in that way so that it can use your emotional processes to help you to create your beliefs in a strong way. Now, you also use your emotions to help you to defend the beliefs that you have. And this is one of the big problems that we all have with beliefs, because when we do confront somebody who doesn't agree with us, as I said before, the first thing that we come about is we say, well, we try to argue with them logically, right? We're going to start with the logical, rational approach. Well, this is why you're wrong, okay? Now, usually they don't buy that, right? So now we turn to plan B, okay, which is our emotions. And our emotions have one of two options as well. So plan A, as I mentioned earlier, is that we're wrong. Maybe we didn't quite get it right. We really should have been thinking about it another way. And from an emotional perspective, that is not something that our brain likes. Because our brain utilizes those beliefs to help us navigate through our world, as I say, to help us survive. And therefore, if we think that we've got the wrong belief system to help us figure out what's going on in our world, we're in a lot of trouble. We're in a very anxiety-provoking situation because we don't want to think that the beliefs that we have, and again, whether political, social, religious, whatever, are wrong, because that's a very problematic situation for our brain to be in. So now our emotions turn to its plan B, which is that the other person must be wrong. All of a sudden our emotions say, hey, that feels kind of good. I'm okay with that. I've figured everything out. I'm still okay. I know exactly how the world is going, and I've got it figured out, so I'm fine. But then the emotions still trigger another little problem here because, well, so why is that person continuing to argue with me? Why do they keep telling me that I'm wrong? And your emotions start to get activated a little bit because now you're starting to get a little upset about this. Because why on earth would they be telling you that you're wrong when you know that they're wrong? There must be something wrong with that person. Maybe there's something evil about that person. And if you start going down that path, you can see how pretty quickly you can get pretty anxious and pretty angry and antagonistic about somebody who disagrees with your belief system. And that is part of what has led to so many problems over the years, where we have a clash of belief systems because we like to think that our belief systems are right. And when we find somebody who disagrees with our belief system, then we're going to work very hard to counteract that other belief system because that will make us feel much better about things. And therefore, our emotions are very critical to our beliefs, to creating our beliefs and maintaining our beliefs, but can also cause problems when we run into conflicts between our belief system and somebody else's. Now, our emotions also spill over into our social influences. And we all like to think that our beliefs come from ourselves, right? We're all our own person, and we've all come to our beliefs our own way, and we know what's right and wrong, and we figured it all out on our own. Well, the evidence points to just the opposite. If you think about your entire life, you have been heavily influenced, and somebody asked this question after the first talk, we have been heavily influenced by all the people around us, our culture, our society, and specifically the people who are directly around us. So most of your beliefs come from your parents, or come from your immediate family. They were the ones who told you and implanted a variety of beliefs in you, perhaps religious beliefs, perhaps political beliefs. One of my favorite little stories these days, we have some friends who are very big Democrats, and their son is in my daughter's class, and at the beginning of the school year, they were asked to write about themselves, and one of the questions that was asked was that they were supposed to talk about, what their favorite thing was, what their biggest fear was. So for biggest fear, most of them are talking about, their nightmares and all that. This little boy wrote George Bush was his biggest fear. So now somehow, this, 6-year-old kid, I know George Bush can sometimes be scary, but I don't know if a 6-year-old kid is going to understand that quite like that. But I mean, this is what's being implanted into his brain, and there's nothing wrong with that. But these are the things that we are influenced about and provide and maintain themselves throughout our whole lives. Now, of course, as you grow up, I mean, part of the reason that you are all here as the students in this university is that you found a place that matched your beliefs. You felt comfortable here. And again, these may not necessarily be religious beliefs, but these could be social beliefs. You found people who kind of thought about the world in your sort of way. And it's not that we don't like to have people challenge our beliefs from time to time, as long as it's kind of moderated and it's not too dramatic. I mean, it'd be really difficult if you were like the only Republican in a place that was all Democrat, or you were the only Democrat in a place that was all Republican, or the only Christian in a place that was all Islamic. That would be very problematic for us because it would just create a lot of anxiety and a lot of problems in the context that you're always having to defend your beliefs. But if you can find a place where they're generally agreeing with your beliefs and you feel comfortable with it, then that also helps to support your belief system and helps to generate a more global perspective of where your beliefs work and how they work within the world. And there was a very cute study that was also done, and I just want to point this out, that what they did was they took a test subject and they put them into a room and they asked them a question based on this slide. They said, of these lines, A, B, and C, which one is the same size as the X line? Okay, and hopefully most of you see this, and I know it's a little small for some of those in the back, but hopefully you think it's big. Okay, now if you put another person in the room with the test subject, and you instruct that person to tell them that no, it's C, then you can get about 10% of people to agree that it's C. And what the study also showed is that the more people you put in the room with that person who say it's C, the more people you can get to change their mind that it's C. And again, now you ask them, well, why did you choose C? Now the brain starts to fill in information again. So they say, well, I thought it was a perceptual thing, and that one's supposed to be closer and one's supposed to be a little further away. I mean, they'll come up with all kinds of reasons when they really don't realize that it's because of the social influences that were implanted in that room to sway their beliefs about whatever was going on. So our beliefs are very much affected by all the people around us all the time. And again, this should help you to see the fact that a lot of the beliefs that you think that you hold so strongly are so easily influenced by other people around you, by your misperceptions, by the cognitive processes that you hope are working well for you. So I don't mean to sound so pessimistic about this, but it is important for you to realize the potential problems with all of the beliefs that we have. Now, let's turn a little bit to the areas that I'm interested in, which is the study of the physiological aspects and correlates of beliefs. So how do beliefs form physiologically? Well, there's two phrases that I like to use nowadays, and I didn't come up with them, so I can't take credit for it. But the first one is that neurons that fire together wire together. It's a cute little phrase that actually does make a lot of sense from a biological perspective. When people have actually looked at how neurons work and how they function, it turns out that the more you use a specific neural pathway, the stronger those neural connections become. There are a series of what are called interneurons, other neurons that help to support the primary neurons. There's chemical messengers and so forth, so that the more you focus on a particular belief, the more that connections that support that belief get stronger in the brain. Now, this makes sense. I mean, all of you have been through school and so forth. How do you learn things? Well, you kind of repeat them over and over again. How did you learn that 1 + 2 = 3? So 1 + 2 = 3, 1 + 2. And ultimately, those connections form so that 1 + 2 = 3. And you remember that, and that becomes your belief system. Okay? Now, the other aspect of how the brain works is the old use it or lose it method. Okay? So all of the neurons, if you had a neuron that said 1 + 2 = 4, well, that ultimately kind of fell apart because that wasn't what was supported by the brain. My favorite example, when I was at college, I took this great course in Russian history. It was a great course, and I studied about all the czars and everything that was going on in Russian history. It was a phenomenal course. And I mean, I'd probably be hard-pressed to name 3 czars for you right now, because I don't use that anymore. But if you ask me to tell you something about dopamine or serotonin, I can rattle off all kinds of stuff about it, because I do that every day. So my brain has lost a lot of the wonderful knowledge that I had at one point. I mean, hopefully somewhere it's lurking back there. But the bottom line is that we have lost a lot of the information that we no longer hold on to. And again, somewhere it's probably swirling around in your unconscious that helps to influence your beliefs a little bit, but it's not the kind of thing that becomes an important part of your belief system right now. Now, how do we ultimately study beliefs? Well, there are lots of different ways of looking at this. We can look at beliefs from a phenomenological perspective. We can ask people about their beliefs. We can compare different groups about their beliefs, and we can see how their beliefs actually affect them. There's been a lot of studies that have looked at people who consider themselves to be fundamentalists, and how those beliefs affect their ways of looking at the world. And people have tried to compare people who are believers versus non-believers, people who believe in religion and spirituality versus those that don't. And what is fascinating to see is that ultimately, all of those belief systems seem to function in fairly similar ways. It's just that they're different because they are a different belief. But for example, a very interesting study that was done that looked at how people think logically. When they looked at people who were religious versus those people who were non-religious, what they found was that both of them make the same kinds of mistakes. It's just that people who are religious make errors when they're presented with something which is anti-religious, and non-believers, or people who consider themselves non-religious, make more mistakes when they're confronted with some kind of logical problem which is more pro-religious. So it's not that they both make the mistakes that go anti their own belief system, but they make them in different ways because they have fundamentally different beliefs. Now, we also have brain imaging studies, some of the ones that I've talked to you about today, and I want to present for you a few more, which show how different belief-promoting practices may affect our brain and what different parts of the brain may be turned on or turned off when we're engaged in those practices. Ultimately, I think we need to find a better way of integrating what we can understand phenomenologically with regard to our beliefs with what we can understand physiologically, and that's obviously been a primary goal of my research. Now, I didn't want to duplicate slides from before, so I'm going to show you a couple of slides from a different practice of meditation. This is transcendental meditation. And this is a meditation practice that many of you are probably familiar with. It was very big in the 60s, and there is the Maharishi University that continues to do research in this area. And we had the opportunity to do a couple of scans of some people doing transcendental meditation, and it is a focus-based meditation. So it's somewhat similar to what we were talking about with our Tibetan Buddhist meditators. And this slide actually shows 6 slices, if you will, of the same person. And I'm going to toggle this back and forth between the baseline waking state and the meditation state. And what I want to start with is to have you focus maybe right around here in the frontal lobes. And you can look at any of these slices because the change will be there on all of them, but I think it's probably most prominent here, that if you look at where my arrow is and I go to the meditation state, you can see that there is a small but consistent little blob of red activity that comes in when the person is meditating. And in fact, actually, it seems to occur over a slightly larger area too. But this is that frontal lobe. This is that part of the brain, the attention area I talked about in the last lecture, that turns on whenever we focus our attention on something. So here they are focusing on a mantra, and they activate the frontal lobes to help them to do that. Now, one of the interesting changes that we saw that was a little bit different is if you look at this structure, I mentioned the thalamus in the last talk. This is a very key relay in the brain that helps different parts of the brain to communicate with each other, and normally has been activated in most of our meditation studies. But in this case, if you look at it, especially if you focus like here, where you see a lot of red, all of a sudden it goes away. So it's kind of interesting that in transcendental meditation, the thalamic activity actually decreases, and we think that this might be associated with the fact that this particular practice is not so much of an energizing kind of experience, but is a very calming kind of experience. And we have to do more research to ultimately figure all this out. But it does seem that depending on what the practice goals are, whether it's designed to create a sense of alertness and arousal, which is what we saw with the Tibetan meditators, or a sense of calmness, which we see in the transcendental meditators, we see differences in what's going on in the brain itself. Now, the next study is also a really important one, I think, because this was a very unusual study that we did of people speaking in tongues. So speaking in tongues, for those of you who are not familiar with it, derives out of the Pentecostal tradition. And what's happening is that they start vocalizing something that kind of sounds like language, but if you actually break it down, it doesn't actually have a clear linguistic structure to it. And I mean, ultimately, it sounds like, it ultimately is nonsensical, at least from a person's perspective of what normal language would be like. But for the person doing it, their perception is that this is the Spirit of God, the voice of God, which is moving through them and causing this experience to happen for them. Now, one of the interesting things that we saw here is that in contrast to all of our other practices of meditation where somebody is willfully concentrating on a particular object, in speaking in tongues, it's almost as if their concentration goes away because they shut off their normal behavioral control and say, just let it happen. So they kind of surrender themselves over to this process. And what we find is just the opposite change in the frontal lobes is what we see in our other practices. So if you look in these areas here, again, I'll have you kind of focus up in here or in here, this is actually a singing state, doing worshipful singing or gospel singing. And again, I'll get my mouse there. And suddenly, and also over here too, you can see it gets much darker. So their frontal lobe activity actually drops down in activity during speaking in tongues, which makes sense, of course, because what's happening is that they are no longer in control, so to speak, of the process. They're surrendering themselves to the process, and they allow this process to happen. Now, it gets back to my very first story. We don't know what this means in an epistemological sense. We don't know if their frontal lobes are shut down because God is shutting them down and allowing this voice to happen, or as a cognitive neuroscientist may argue, it shuts down so that some other part of the brain can take over this process, a more perhaps rudimentary language area that turns on. Now, it's difficult for us to know whether or not some of the other areas that we saw activated during this practice are the ones responsible for that, but nonetheless, it provides us for a compelling understanding of why their experience, at least, is that they are no longer in control of the process. And I think that becomes very important for us to understand how that ultimately plays out in what they believe is happening during this particular process and what they think is actually happening to them. So what beliefs do form as the result of these kinds of religious and spiritual practices? Well, again, religious individuals like our nun, like our speakers in tongues, they use this information to help them to support their belief in what religion does to them, the importance of religion in their life, and how it affects them. And of course, the non-religious individual looks at the same data and says, there it is, it's nothing more than what's in your head. And I would submit that how one decides to interpret this information depends deeply on the beliefs that they hold going into this, so that the person who wants to find support for their religious beliefs is going to find it, and for those people who want to find support for their non-religious beliefs will find support for that. Now, the problem is, how do we know if we're getting any closer to what reality is all about? And I posed this question at the end of my talk in the morning, but this, to me, is also a very fundamental problem with regard to how our beliefs go. Well, before we address that a little bit more, a couple of people had asked me about atheism, and we did do an interesting study on a couple of atheists. It was hard to get a whole bunch to come in and to do something for us, and particularly, this is where we run into a lot of methodological problems, because how do you do a real good comparison? Ideally, you would want to have an atheist come into your lab and pray. That doesn't work too well, okay? In fact, we actually did have an individual who was able to come in and did try to do a meditation practice on God, And it didn't work out that well. In fact, what we did see in their brain was that their frontal lobes kind of vacillated back and forth. I mean, they didn't really turn on, they didn't really turn off, and it sort of reflected a little bit of cognitive dissonance, which would make some sense, right? I mean, they're trying to concentrate on something that they don't really believe in. So that kind of creates a bit of a problem for them. Now, part of the problem with studying atheism as a concept is that there are a lot of different types. So there are atheists who may be non-theistic, but may consider themselves to be very spiritual. There may be atheists who feel that there is a deep interconnectedness of all things. There may be an atheist who says that there's a consciousness that pervades the universe, but we wouldn't call this God, or we wouldn't talk about it as God in a Christian or Jewish type of conception. Then there could be those atheists who are pure materialists, who say, this is the here and the now, this is it, there's nothing else, there's nothing supernatural, and this is what the world is all about. And also there's some very interesting indigenous religions where they have more of like an ancestor worship. So they don't actually believe in God so much as that they believe in the spirits of the dead and so forth. And again, they're non-theistic, but they are not necessarily atheistic in the sense that they are purely materialistic. And I would argue that all of these are still belief systems. They're still beliefs about the world that people then decide to incorporate a God or not to incorporate a God. And some people have tried to look at this in the context of, is there some sort of physiological correlate? Well, somebody asked the question in the first lecture about Dean Hamer's work in terms of, they asked the question the opposite way, is there a gene or something that codes or predisposes people to be more religious or spiritual? And he provided some evidence that there may be. Now, I think it's probably much more complicated than a single gene, but the idea was that there was a correlation between a particular gene called the VMAT2 gene that codes for a receptor in the brain that's involved in serotonin and dopamine that seems to be associated with the experience of self-transcendence. Okay, now that's not religion, and it may not even be spirituality, depending on how you define these terms, but nonetheless, it speaks very clearly that there may be certain predispositions. Those people who have a certain genetic predisposition may be more likely to embrace a religious tradition or a spiritual tradition than other people who don't have this particular genetic configuration. In our studies, we actually looked at people who were non-meditators versus those people who were long-term meditators. And what we found was that the long-term meditators had substantially different changes in their brain compared to the non-meditators. Unfortunately, we're stuck with a bit of a chicken and the egg question. We don't know if their brains are different because they had been meditating for 15 or 20 years, or whether they were built that way to begin with, and their brains were just predisposed to finding meditation or spiritual practices as something that just resonated very deeply with them. So we don't know for sure. But it does suggest that there may be some physiological differences in terms of how people believe different things about the world. And again, there was one other study, Dr. Nina Azari actually did an interesting study where they found that there were differences between people who were religious and non-religious when they were doing recitation of religious and non-religious texts. So it was interesting to see how these different correlates are occurring, but we still have a long way to go, I think, in terms of being able to say there is something fundamentally different about an atheist's brain versus somebody who's a devout spiritual person's brain. We just don't know. But it raises some wonderful questions for us to think about in terms of how our beliefs form and why somebody ultimately looks towards atheism as a belief system or a particular religion as a belief system. And again, atheists are somebody who may reject all of the belief systems, whereas a person who feels very strongly about one religion actually still rejects most religions, right? They just believe in their own particular religion. So ultimately, they all seem to be in that same basic boat about having belief systems about our world that then are trying to use, that they ultimately try to use to figure out how best to survive for themselves and what makes sense for them. Now let me return back to beliefs. So the physiology of these different belief systems. Well, I think the basic concept, what I talked about earlier about the neurons that fire together, wire together, that can be also thought about in this way, that the more we focus on a particular belief, the more we do believe it, the more it becomes a fundamental part of our brain's function, and the more that becomes part of our belief system that we use to understand the world, the more it becomes part of our reality. That's an interesting point, because the idea is that this is why rituals and practices like meditation and prayer work so effectively, because they have that repetitious element to it. They keep that neuron firing together, wiring together concept going. so that you go to church every Sunday and you hear the same stories and you say the same prayers. These are the things that get written down into the brain, into the neural connections of your brain, that become such a critical part of your reality, because this is how the brain works, and they're taking advantage of that. Now, as that happens, again, it ties back into all those other processes that we talk about. You get the perceptions that support your beliefs. You then have the logical arguments that you hear and support your beliefs. And you feel the strong emotions that help you to support the belief. And this is true for everything. And this is why I say this topic is much more broad than just religion and spirituality alone, because this is true for politics, this is true for your social world, for the scientific world as well. And of course, I mean, this is something that I always want to be very clear about. As a scientist, we so often see problems that people have when trying to embrace new scientific evidence. When I was going through medical school, it was absolutely what we should do, that, for example, we should treat every postmenopausal woman with hormone replacement therapy. That was the way to do it. Okay? When the first data came out to suggest we shouldn't do it that way, everybody said, the data's bad, they don't know what they're doing, they came from a lousy university, right? And then ultimately, enough new data came down the road, and suddenly people said, hey, we got to stop doing this. This is hurting people instead of helping people. Same is true, I remember, when we used to treat ulcers, stomach ulcers, used to treat them with antacids. And then finally somebody said, you know what, it's a bacteria. And everybody said, you are absolutely out of your mind. There is no way that there is a bacteria that's involved. How do we treat them today? We give people antibiotics. Okay? But that guy, I think, probably lost his tenureship and everything because of what he was trying to say. So, scientists like to think that they've got a nice lock on the world too. And we find out so oftentimes that they're not always so correct either. So what can we say about all of this? Well, again, I would argue that the brain in many ways is a believing machine. It's a believing machine in many ways because it has to be. We look out at our world, and we try to come up with some way of understanding that world. We try to make some sense out of that world, and therefore we develop these beliefs to help us to do that. And these beliefs help us with our friends. If we live in a community with other people who are our friends, the beliefs tell us, how do we act? What are we supposed to do to be nice to our friends? And what do we expect in return for that? And when things don't go that well, we have to reevaluate those belief systems. So our beliefs are a critical part of everything that we do. Beliefs affect every part of our lives. And again, they affect our ways of voting. They affect our ways of why we go to school, where we go to school, where we go to work, how we go to work, what we want to do in life, who we want to be with. It affects every part of our lives. And as we saw, every part of our lives affects our beliefs. So as we see something, when we, it's funny because, and this is actually a great example of this, as I was getting ready to come out here, my wife was very worried that I was going to fly right into a big wildfire. Okay, because that's all we see, and the news in Philadelphia is, it's like all of California is engulfed in flames. Okay? And and I kept telling her, don't worry, but it's amazing how our perceptions affect our beliefs and change what we, she was very genuinely worried, and I understood that. But it's amazing how our perceptions change our beliefs about the world. And again, and then she tells, so now I start to get a little nervous because she's telling me, and I figure, why is she worried about it? I had to call my friend Mark, I call Eloise and everything, no, it's okay, don't worry. But again, the important point is that every part of our lives does affect our beliefs, and beliefs ultimately make us who we are. Who you ultimately become, what job, what vocation you ultimately go into, how you ultimately decide to live your life, where you decide to live your life. These are all based on the beliefs that we have, and they are ultimately, I would argue, the essence of our being. And if I may be so bold to take our good friend Descartes' statement about cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, perhaps we can make one minor modification to credo ergo sum, I believe, therefore I am, and perhaps it'll give us more pause to think about all the beliefs that we actually have and how we understand their impact on us as individuals. Now, if you are interested, the Why We Believe What We Believe book, it's actually, the paperback version is called Born to Believe, so if you got one, they're the same book. And I meant to put this up at the end of my last lecture, but if you are interested, we do have some interesting information on our center's website, which is the Center for Spirituality in the Mind. And one of the research projects that we have is an ongoing project, and I've mentioned this to a few people, is we've been doing a wonderful survey of people's spiritual experiences. And if you are interested in helping us do our research, go to this. It's at neurotheology.net. Depending on how much you want to write, it'll take you about a half hour to an hour to do. There's a lot of questionnaires and stuff like that. And we have just been getting a wonderful source of information. A lot of it's going to go into our next book called How God Changes Your Brain. And it's really remarkable how people think about their own spiritual experiences and how that affects their beliefs and the ways in which they are working within the world. So I'll leave that up. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.